Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Drew was once seen as a symbol of hope and renewal in the eyes of the people of Port Charles. Having endured captivity and personal tragedy, he returned not only as a survivor but as a man driven by a noble desire to rebuild his life with purpose. His love for his daughter Scout was the cornerstone of his redemption arc, a quiet, consistent reminder of who he was striving to become. Alongside this, his blossoming relationship with Willow represented everything he yearned for: stability, love, and a future unburdened by the past. However, when their much-anticipated wedding collapsed under the weight of rumors, betrayal, and manipulative outside forces, Drew began to unravel. The failed ceremony did more than shatter a romantic bond, it fractured Drew's very sense of identity. Where he once saw Willow as his soulmate and partner in healing, he now saw only a painful embodiment of rejection and humiliation. And in that emotional chaos, Drew made a chilling decision: he would sever all ties that tethered him emotionally to anything vulnerable, including his own daughter. The abandonment of Scout did not happen in one sweeping, obvious moment. At first, Drew maintained the appearance of fatherly involvement. Occasional visits, token gestures, empty promises delivered with hollow smiles. But over time, those visits grew fewer, the promises faded into silence, and the warmth in his eyes when he looked at Scout vanished, replaced by a cold detachment that the young girl could sense even if she couldn't yet name it. He never said aloud that he was stepping away from fatherhood, but every subtle withdrawal, every missed recital, every unanswered call spoke volumes. Drew began to treat Scout less like a daughter and more like a pawn in a chessboard of political and personal warfare. When Monica, in a rare attempt to break through to him, asked about his long-term intentions for Scout's well-being, Drew offered nothing: no answer, no emotion, no recognition of the child he once swore to protect. It was as if Scout had ceased to exist in his version of the future. Scout, wise beyond her years due to all she had endured, started to sense something was wrong. The once familiar embrace of her father was now absent. She learned to stop asking when he would come. She started to shrink in presence, retreating inward as the realization dawned on her: she was no longer a priority to the one person who had once made her feel safe in a chaotic world. It was in this space of deep emotional neglect that Alexis, her grandmother, was forced to make one of the most painful decisions of her life. Watching Scout wither under the weight of invisible abandonment, Alexis could no longer sit idly by. But for her, petitioning for custody was more than a legal procedure, it was a confrontation with her own past. She felt the sting of betrayal, not toward Scout, but toward Drew and the daughter she once called family. Her heart bore the scars of her failures with Christina, of years spent trying to overcompensate for parental missteps, and now she feared she might be repeating those same errors with Scout by hesitating too long. Still, Alexis gathered the necessary documents, filed the appropriate legal motions, and steeled herself for the fallout. The community's response was swift and divided. Some rallied behind her, applauding her courage and recognizing the desperate need for someone to step in for Scout before it was too late. Others accused her of acting out of guilt, suggesting this was more about atoning for her negligence with Christina than it was about Scout's best interests. Whispers began to spread that Alexis was only trying to restore her own public image through a self-serving custody battle. But through all the public discourse and whispered judgments, one truth remained unmoved: Scout was an innocent child caught in the emotional crossfire of a fractured family, watching as the grown-ups around her continued to break promises they once held sacred. Meanwhile, Drew's descent into darkness only accelerated. Having emotionally disconnected from Scout and Willow, he shifted his full attention to calculated manipulation and strategic coercion. Power, not love, became his currency. His latest target was Stella, who had once risked her own professional standing to help Martin regain access to health insurance. What had been an act of quiet heroism born from compassion, Drew now saw as leverage, an exploitable weakness in his ongoing campaign of intimidation. Working quietly behind the scenes, he gathered information through Martin, piecing together the circumstances of Stella's actions until he was confident enough to weaponize them. The idea was simple. Expose Stella's procedural infractions and use that threat to gain control over Curtis, destabilizing his life just as Curtis had, in Drew's view, destroyed his. It didn't stop there. Drew's eye turned to Portia as well, ready to cast her into the storm should she get in his way or try to shield Curtis. She, too, could be tainted by proximity if the right buttons were pushed and the right documents released. Drew no longer saw people, he saw opportunities. Allies became liabilities. Empathy had no place in his plans. It was all transactional, and it was all about domination. Each step deeper into his web of manipulation distanced him further from the man he once aspired to be. The whispers about his moral decay grew louder, but Drew was too consumed by his quest for control to hear them. All the while, Scout remained a silent casualty of her father's metamorphosis. Now under Alexis's care, she struggled to make sense of her new normal. Her room, once decorated with symbols of family and love, felt colder now. Pictures with Drew had been quietly removed, not by order, but through unspoken agreement. She no longer asked if he would call. Instead, she would sit by the window some nights, wondering if he even remembered her birthday, if he would ever come back, if he even missed her. Alexis did her best to fill the void, but she could see the ache in Scout's eyes, the kind of ache that no grandparent could completely heal. It wasn't just absence Scout felt, it was rejection. The people of Port Charles took notice. Online forums and community boards buzzed with outrage that the show seemed to sideline the emotional fallout of Scout's abandonment. Fans questioned why so much airtime was given to characters chasing revenge when the very real heartbreak of a child was left unexplored. They demanded accountability, on and off the screen. They asked what kind of message was being sent by allowing Drew's transformation into a manipulative tyrant to go unchecked, and what was being done to give Scout the narrative justice she deserved. In the end, the tragedy was not simply that Drew had changed, it was that he had allowed his pain to erase his humanity. In the wake of a failed wedding, he didn't just lose Willow. He lost the moral compass that once kept him tethered to compassion. He lost the trust of his daughter. He lost the respect of his friends. And perhaps most heartbreaking of all, he lost the chance to be remembered as a hero in the eyes of the one person who had loved him unconditionally. Scout. Now, the question remains, can anything be salvaged from the wreckage Drew has left behind, or has he already crossed the point of no return? For Scout's sake, one can only hope that redemption is still possible, before the child he left behind grows up believing she was never worth fighting for. No longer the man once fueled by righteousness and redemption, Drew had transformed into something unrecognizable, a cold, calculated shadow of his former self, driven not by justice or loyalty, but by vengeance and control. The gentle intensity that once defined his presence had hardened into a permanent edge. He now moved through Port Charles like a storm cloaked in charm, smiling when necessary, manipulating without remorse, and eliminating obstacles one by one. His strategy was precise and insidious, feigning reconciliation with Curtis while plotting his dismantlement behind closed doors. Every word Drew spoke dripped with double meaning. Every handshake was a distraction. And every alliance was a tool meant to be discarded once its usefulness expired. Curtis, the latest target of Drew's vendetta, remained unaware of the trap being constructed around him. Drew's friendliness, his false declarations of peace, were mere bait to lower Curtis's guard. And while Curtis tried to rebuild his fractured life, navigating personal losses and professional instability, Drew was busy pulling the strings, orchestrating one calculated attack after another. Each move, each piece of information weaponized, was part of a larger endgame, total humiliation, not just for Curtis but for anyone who had ever crossed or questioned Drew. Those closest to Drew began to feel the unsettling shift. Tracy, a longtime confidant, began to notice the flickers of ruthlessness behind his carefully measured words. Martin, who once saw Drew as a man of decency and principle, now grew wary of every request, every inquiry that hinted at ulterior motives. Their instincts, sharpened by years of political maneuvering in Port Charles, warned them that something fundamental had broken inside Drew. This wasn't just a man acting out of pain. This was someone who had surrendered to the dark allure of power. Even Kai Taylor, known for his aloof pragmatism, could no longer ignore the threat Drew posed. Kai had always understood the fragile balance that kept Port Charles from imploding, and Drew's growing influence was now tilting that balance dangerously out of alignment. While Drew expanded his campaign of domination, tightening his grip on the secrets and weaknesses of others, Scout was left to pick up the pieces of a life shattered in silence. Living with Alexis, she tried to adapt to a new routine, to find comfort in the stability her grandmother offered. But something had been lost in the transition, something that bedtime stories and warm meals couldn't replace. The absence of her father hung over her like a storm cloud that never cleared. The walls of her bedroom, once adorned with drawings and photos capturing happy memories, had been stripped bare. The space no longer felt like a home but a shelter, temporary, fragile, and haunted by the echoes of what used to be. Each night, when the house grew quiet and the lights dimmed, Scout would crawl under her blanket, clutching the edges tightly as if they could shield her from the questions that wouldn't go away. Sometimes, her voice would break the silence in a whisper. "Is Daddy coming back?" Alexis, sitting at her bedside, would feel her throat close around the answer she couldn't give. She would pull Scout into her arms, hold her tight, and hope that the embrace would be enough to bridge the painful truth. But Scout was no longer a baby. She knew what silence meant. She knew that sometimes the worst answer was no answer at all. That silence, heavy, wordless, and steeped in guilt, became the rhythm of Alexis's days. Every time she passed by a family photo, every time she saw a child holding their parent's hand on the street, she was reminded of what had been lost and what she was now tasked with preserving. She couldn't replace Drew, and she knew it. But she would not let Scout disappear into the same void that had consumed her father. Alexis resolved to fight not just for legal custody, but for emotional salvation. For the belief that Scout still mattered, that she was not just collateral damage in a war she never chose to be part of. The people of Port Charles began to take notice. Viewers who once saw Scout as a promising symbol of legacy and continuity were now outraged by how the show had seemingly pushed her to the periphery. Online discussions exploded with criticism. Why was a character like Scout, whose lineage connected major families and whose emotional story resonated so deeply, being reduced to a footnote? Fans demanded more than passing mentions. They called for accountability. They called for stories that reflected the real cost of betrayal and abandonment, not through the lens of courtroom showdowns or corporate warfare, but through the eyes of a child trying to make sense of a fractured world. The message was clear: Scout wasn't just another supporting character. She was the embodiment of what happens when love is twisted by ambition, when promises are broken by pride, and when the innocent are left behind. Viewers weren't asking for spectacle, they were asking for truth. They wanted the narrative to acknowledge that amidst all the betrayals, blackmail, and backroom deals, the greatest tragedy unfolding was the silent erosion of a little girl's trust in the people who were supposed to love her most. And at the center of it all, Drew remained unrepentant. Whatever fragments of guilt he once carried had been buried beneath layers of justification. To him, his actions were necessary, strategic, even noble in their twisted logic. He believed that his pain entitled him to vengeance, that those who had wronged him deserved ruin. The fact that Scout was suffering as a result, that was collateral. And in the mind of the man Drew had become, collateral damage was inevitable. But to Scout, there was nothing strategic about a broken heart. To her, it wasn't politics. It was bedtime without a goodnight kiss, it was birthdays with an empty chair, it was the echo of laughter she could no longer remember. Her pain was not dramatic, it was quiet, constant, and real. And that is what the people of Port Charles were beginning to say louder than ever. Drew Kane may have claimed many victories in his path of destruction, but in turning his back on his daughter, he had suffered the greatest loss of all. Not power. Not reputation. But love. Irreplaceable, unconditional, and now, perhaps, forever gone. And as the truths surrounding Drew's actions begin to unravel in painful succession, his calculated blackmail, his deliberate betrayals, and the cold manipulation of those who once stood by his side, it becomes glaringly clear that the damage he has inflicted may be far too deep, too widespread, and too personal to ever truly repair. There is no moment of clarity, no dramatic confession that wipes away the impact of what he has done. Because the real tragedy of Drew's descent is not just in what he has become, but in what he has willingly chosen to abandon along the way, the people who loved him, the promises he made, and most tragically, the innocent child who once looked at him as if he hung the stars in the sky. Scout, too young to understand the full depth of her father's motivations, nonetheless feels every fracture of his absence like sharp edges beneath her skin. Her heart, still tender and open to the world, may someday be capable of forgiving him, because children are resilient, often far more than they should have to be. But forgiveness does not erase memory. It does not mend the nights she spent clutching a pillow where his voice should have been. It does not undo the aching moments when she watched other children run into their parents' arms while she stood on the sidelines of her own life, wondering what she did wrong. Forgiveness may come, but healing is not linear, and the scars left by Drew's abandonment will remain imprinted in her sense of worth, trust, and understanding of love. Alexis, burdened with both the responsibility of care and the silent guilt of a mother who once failed to protect her own children from their father's mistakes, now carries Scout's pain like a second skin. She does everything she can. Packing school lunches with care, reading bedtime stories with gentleness, whispering reassurances into Scout's hair as the child silently cries herself to sleep, but deep down, Alexis knows that her love can never fully replace what has been lost. The bond between a father and daughter is not one that can be replicated, it is unique in its texture, in its emotional DNA. Alexis can be a refuge, a protector, and even a hero in her granddaughter's eyes. But she will never be the man who promised Scout she would always come first, and then chose ambition over affection. Meanwhile, the town that once held Drew up as a shining example of resilience now grapples with its own complicity. Port Charles has always been a city of second chances, some might argue too many, but Drew's fall from grace is unlike the others. This isn't the story of a villain rising and falling. It's the story of a supposed hero willingly shedding his humanity to become something else entirely. The man who once fought for justice now manipulates it. The father who once held Scout's tiny hand now ignores her existence. And the community that once cheered his return now watches in stunned silence as he becomes the very thing he once swore to fight. The realization hits hard, Drew didn't simply lose his way. He chose a new path. One paved in retribution and power, littered with collateral damage he never stopped to count. And Scout, his own daughter, became just another casualty. While he collected secrets and blackmailed friends, she waited by windows and doorways, believing that if she stayed patient, her father would remember who he was. But that day never came. Instead, she was met with silence, a silence that screamed louder than any betrayal ever could. In the rooms of City Hall and the chambers of Family Court, papers were filed and decisions were made. Custody granted. Visitation rights ignored. But the true courtroom is the one in Scout's heart, where every unanswered question stands as evidence of abandonment. Why did he stop calling? What did I do? Was I not enough? These are the questions she carries, invisible to most but crushing in their weight. They shape her world, her relationships, and her belief in love. Because when your first example of unconditional love walks away, how do you ever trust again? Port Charles can no longer turn a blind eye. Citizens have begun to speak out, fans, neighbors, allies, each one demanding that Scout's story no longer be reduced to a narrative afterthought. They urge the writers, the leaders, the caretakers of this town to remember that children are not props in adult dramas. They are not punctuation marks at the end of tragic monologues. They are living, breathing hearts that break quietly and piece themselves back together in private, away from the spotlight. And they deserve better. They deserve protection not only from external threats but from the internal decay of those meant to love them. They deserve advocacy, not when it's convenient, but when it is most difficult. And most of all, they deserve the truth, even when it's ugly, even when it indicts those the town once revered. Because the longer Scout's pain is ignored, the more normalized her abandonment becomes. And in that normalization, a dangerous message takes root, that children can be sacrificed in the name of adult ambition, and no one will blink. This is the tragedy Port Charles must now reckon with. Not a bomb detonated. Not a courtroom scandal. But a quiet devastation, the kind that creeps in through broken promises and unanswered phone calls. A father who traded his daughter's love for leverage. A child who never asked to be caught in a war. A grandmother trying desperately to make things right. And a town learning, once again, that the greatest threats are not always those who come bearing weapons, but those who walk away when they are needed most. In the end, Drew's legacy will not be his victories in boardrooms or his carefully plotted revenge. It will be the silence he left behind in his daughter's life. The empty seat at school plays. The missed birthdays. The whispered questions Alexis couldn't bear to answer.